Today we are going to look at mammalian gas exchange. Now, when we take a closer look, we can see his lungs, and this here is the trachea, and these are bronchus or bronchi when there are more than one of them, and the bronchi separate into bronchioles, which we can see here, and these branch out like a tree, which lead into the alveoli, which are tiny sacs full of air covered by capillaries for very efficient gas exchange. Now, the lungs and the heart are protected by the rib cage, and between the ribs we can see the intercostal muscles, which are important for ventilation, and we also need a diaphragm. So just before I mentioned the alveoli, and these are tiny gas-filled sacs at the end of the bronchioles, and we can see here that they are covered by a network of capillaries, and the process by which gas exchange takes place is diffusion, and this is a passive process, so it does not need energy from respiration. Now, there are some adaptations of alveoli which we need to mention, and these adaptations make them suitable for their function. Firstly, as we've already mentioned, there is a network of capillaries covering the alveoli, and this means that there's a high surface area for the gas exchange to take place on. Secondly, the alveoli are covered with an alveolar epithelium, which is basically the external surface, and this is very thin, it's just one cell thick, which provides a very short diffusion pathway. Next, there is a constant blood flow and ventilation going on in the body, and especially around the alveoli, which maintains a very steep concentration gradient between oxygen and carbon dioxide. And lastly, there is a high number of alveoli, which also adds to the high surface area over which diffusion takes place. The process of ventilation takes place in two separate stages, and it's a cycle, so we'll start at inspiration, which is the overall movement of air into the lungs from the atmosphere, and this must mean that the pressure in the outside air is higher than in the lungs. Expiration is the opposite. This is the overall movement of air out of the lungs and into the atmosphere, where there is a lower pressure. Now, you can see the words active and passive written here, and this means that inspiration is an active process because it uses energy from aerobic respiration, but expiration is a passive process, and we're about to see why. External intercostal muscles contract, and so does the diaphragm, and this contraction of muscles uses energy, which is what makes it an active process, and due to this movement, the rib cage moves upwards and outwards, and so the volume of this area, known as the thoracic cavity, increases. Because there's a greater volume, the diaphragm flattens, and therefore the pressure of the air within the lungs falls, because the same volume is being held, but there's more room for it to be held in. And air naturally moves down a pressure gradient, and therefore air from the outside atmosphere enters the lungs. Is the complete opposite of this process, because when green represents the movement of air, during inspiration air moves into the lungs, and expiration is the movement of air out of the lungs. So firstly, the external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm muscles relax, and they're not contracting, they're just relaxing, which doesn't require energy, which is why this is a passive process and inspiration is an active process. The rib cage moves downwards and inwards to create a curved shape, as we can see here, and there is a reduction in volume of the thoracic cavity. I said that wrong before. The thoracic cavity, because the same volume of air is being held in a smaller space, and the pressure begins to exceed, so it's higher than that of the atmospheric pressure, and so air naturally moves down the pressure gradient and it enters the atmosphere, so it leaves the lungs to enter the atmosphere. Now, expiration can be forced, and during this, the external intercostal muscles relax, and the intercostal internal muscles contract, which further pulls the rib cage downwards and inwards to further reduce the volume and expel all air from the lungs. This is an antagonistic movement because two pairs of muscles are working in opposite ways. You have the external intercostal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles. One of them is contracting, one of them relaxes. Inspiration, and why, when air is entering the lungs, the alveolar epithelium, so the surface of the alveoli, is a site of rapid diffusion. So firstly, the filtration of blood throughout the vessels is slow. So if we imagine a vessel here, and red blood cells, if we just draw that like this, are moving slowly. And if this is a capillary, and it's passing an alveoli, so remember, a sac of air, and it's moving slowly, there's going to be a high rate of diffusion because there's more time for the exchange of respiratory gases to take place. And the flattening of red blood cells, so if I draw that like this, if we imagine the capillary is quite a small vessel, so it might need to flatten itself like this to fit through, against the capillary walls reduces the distance of the pathway. If we remember that in diffusion, the distance of the diffusion pathway is one of the main factors in the rate of diffusion. Remembering also that the alveoli have thin walls, and the capillaries also have a wall which is only one cell thick, which further shortens the diffusion pathway, so the distance over which the gases must travel to be exchanged. The alveoli also have a high surface area due to their shape, which is an example of how its shape suits its function. The main key terms would be inspiration, so the overall movement of air from the outside atmosphere into the lungs; expiration, which is the reverse of that, remembering that this is active and this is passive; and finally, intercostal and antagonistic, so thinking about the muscles involved in ventilation.